Just because the customer is having a problem or they need to figure something out does not necessarily mean that it's escalated. But you do need that really well-defined path in order to escalate an account when the situation calls for it.
Sometimes some customers make a lot of noise, which is not really an escalation, but then,
Exactly.
the noisy people get the most attention. So
Yeah.
you leave everything else and focus that, which results into a lot of unnecessary firefights.
Anytime you have an escalation, one of your primary responsibilities is to restore trust. You're trying to regain credibility with your customer because something has gone wrong. Therefore, they are going to be a little bit more reluctant to really give you their trust. Let's say an executive was involved in the escalation. Maybe that executive checks in 2 weeks later to just say, how are things now that the dust has settled? Are we still, have we restored your trust? Are there more things that we need to do? And there may be. When everything is urgent, nothing is urgent because we don't know how
Exactly.
to distinguish your priorities. And so what I really want to do is agree with you right now. What are the top 3 things that we want to accomplish over the next 30 days?
Hello, and welcome to this new episode of Scale Podcast. Hope you're all doing great. I know it's been a while since our previous podcast. I've been really busy lately. You know how things are crazy in customer success. Anyway, the good news is that we're here today in this episode and we're going to talk about escalation management. We'll talk about what is escalation, who owns escalation, and how to handle communication during escalation. What happens after escalation is handled, what is the root cause, and how do we learn about it. And to talk on this topic, we have a very special guest, Parker Chase-Corwin. He will take us into the journey from frustration to resolution, a deep dive into escalation management. He's a customer success leader. He has spent over 2 decades building and scaling high-performing customer success and post-sales team across various company sizes and stages. Leveraging this experience, he now acts as a consultant, helping businesses optimize their customer management processes. Additionally, Parker plays a key role as a limited partner with Stage 2 Capital, where he offers valuable guidance to early stage startups as they establish their own customer programs. So he comes with the insight of an investor, an advisor, an operator. So he brings tons of practical experience with him. Very warm welcome to the podcast, Parker. How have you been?
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much. Doing very well. I'm excited to dig into this topic because I feel like it's not
Awesome.
quite enough attention, actually. So it's definitely something that needs a little spotlight shine on it.
Awesome, Parker. The first question that I always ask is, how did you land up in customer success?
Oh my goodness. Let's see. I started my career actually on the fulfillment side. So my very first job was burning CDs of people's data. I worked at a PC backup company. So I was burning recovery data onto CDs and then shipping them out. I was sort of in the support organization. And then from there, I think I found a niche where I became very good at working with existing customers. And that led from one thing to another. I started to become an inside sales rep, supporting outside field reps, turned into account management, started to grow an account management team. And then around that time, we were starting to see customer success become a thing. So at that point, I was very early in on the journey there. And for me, it was just a wonderful opportunity to be able to jump in, sort of define what customer success was at our company, and just never really looked back. So since there, I've been building and scaling teams, as you said, for about 20 years.
Awesome. And over these years, you must have handled thousands of escalations.
More than my share, I'm sure. Yeah.
So let's dive in. Take us from frustration to resolution, Parker, and hopefully we can all, all the listeners and me, of course, we can all understand how we can manage this very important problem so much better.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, The way I think about escalations, I mean, they're a critical part of customer management. You're never going to get everything 100% right. And so everyone should expect that escalations will happen. They tend to be extremely costly for an organization. So
True.
what I like to do is start with defining actually what is an
Yes.
escalation, because I think it's actually one of the most overutilized words in an organization, particularly in a customer facing team. So just because the customer is having a problem or they need to figure something out does not necessarily mean that it's escalated. But you do need that really well-defined path in order to escalate an account when the situation calls for it. So I find that the word creates a lot of confusion. I like to start with defining what our processes are. So first of all, if the customer is escalating, they're asking or sort of going outside of the normal path. In some ways, that's our fault. We haven't communicated well enough to the customer how to get the help that they need. And I think it's important for our teams to recognize it. Is the customer bypassing the process because they have to, or because they are ignorant to what the process is, or they just are going the path of least resistance and reaching out to the executive because that's the person that they know and they know they'll get an answer. But if we reinforce bad behaviors, we're never going to get out of this cycle of escalation. So I think it's
True.
super important for internal teams to know what the process is and be able to distinguish, is this something that really requires an escalation, or is this something that is could be handled by our normal processes?
Like what I have seen mostly is that sometimes some customers make a lot of noise, which is not really an escalation, but then
Exactly.
the noisy people get the most attention. So
Yeah.
you leave everything else and focus that, which results into a lot of unnecessary firefights where
100%.
important
Yeah.
things have been missed.
Absolutely. And so I think one way to help with this is internally, I like to describe escalations as growth inhibitors. Because really,
True.
when you think about what an escalation is we're pulling our best people and we're
Yes.
putting them on that customer. We're distracting them from their normal work, whether that's a product person or a executive or something along those lines. And sometimes that's 100% necessary, but many times it's not. And so if we start to sort of rebrand what an escalation actually is, I think there's a certain understanding internally that if I'm going to push that big red button, there better be a good reason for it.
True.
So I think by talking about it in terms of how it inhibits our growth as a company, or actually leaks some of our profits, because again, it's very costly. I think that can help to sort of normalize a little bit internally and take some of the emotion out of it, add a little bit of critical thinking in terms of, before I send this email over, is this really necessary?
So, step one, of course, define what escalation is and not go with the noisy person and
Yes.
have a plan around it. Now, step two that I want to ask you, how do you set up accountability and resources in terms of when the escalation needs to be managed?
Yeah. So escalations, and let's assume now that we're talking about a true escalation. So this is something
Yes.
where I think there's a sort of continuing the definition. I think there is a distinction between an escalated situation and an escalated customer, right? So
True.
there
Correct.
are folks that are responsible for situations, whether that's on the technical support team or whether that's the customer success manager or product manager, something along those lines. And there are, call it unhealthy accounts as a result of that. If we've kind of drifted past unhealthy and we're now in the point of needing to rescue an account, you've got to have a person who is really ultimately accountable for the health of that customer. So there typically is a team of folks that's responsible for an escalation, but you need one single person to hold that accountability. So what I like to do is, and of course, every situation is a little bit different, but I like to designate someone who can be that point person. And they are ultimately going to mobilize the troops, make sure that we have the right response team in place, but they are going to be the quarterback. They're going to be the person that's going to move that escalation from, a rescue status to resolution. They need a couple of things though in order to do that. So first of all, they have to have the bandwidth, right? They can't be doing this,
Of course.
for hours. Like they have to be
Yes.
available and ready for this. So you designate someone who can put the right attention on the account, and they do need some level of authority. So they are going to have to mobilize the troops. They are going to have to get the attention of resources within the organization. And so there's a certain amount of authority that they're going to need to be granted to be able to say, I need to pull this resource for this situation so that we can put out this fire.
Who would you typically assign that within an organization?
Yeah, usually I'd say it depends again a little bit on the situation. So if it's a very technical escalation, maybe it's a senior support resource, somebody who's very close to, could be a product, someone from the product team, a product manager, depending on whether it's like a defect fix or something along those lines. But you want to have I say a well-rounded team in most situations. So you're looking for a relationship manager, you're looking for generally a technical resource, and then sometimes you have an executive who's also sort of the shop as well. So I think that blend of folks, you think about sort of the point person being one of those people, depending on the situation, and then the other people in sort of a supporting role.
Correct, correct. Okay. Now moving on to next. Now that you have put in so many players in the structure,
Yes.
right? So there are multiple people from the company side, and there will be multiple people from the customer side, possibly. If it's a customer escalation, if it's not one technical escalation, generally lesser people. But if it's a bigger issue, more
Yeah.
people are involved. Now, when people are involved, communication becomes a very big problem.
Yeah.
Because it requires so many people talking, and there are parallel discussions, there's a history to it, and things, there's a history of the relationship, then a history of the problem. So how do you handle in such a the big picture communication to make sure the story is aligned and everybody is aware, and they are all on the same level of information that they need to be?
Yeah, man, it's such an important point, and it's a little bit of art and science for sure, but I think you can definitely create more of a science behind it, so that you're not relying on people's judgment and such. So process is super important here. I think there's a distinction between the rules of external communication versus the rules of internal communication. So what I would say is they're different motions. They should be treated consciously as such. And externally, anytime you have an escalation, one of your primary responsibilities is to restore trust. You're trying to regain credibility with your customer because something has gone wrong. Therefore, they are going to be a little bit more reluctant to really give you their trust. You've got to restore that. And so communication is one of those vehicles that really allows you to do that. So over communicate is, I think, essential. And what I mean by that is you want to make sure that you're providing updates. As you mentioned, there can be a lot of stakeholders on the other side. So it may require multiple communications or maybe one summary communication, something along those lines. But you really want to make sure that you are over communicating where you're at. I've seen often escalations really go south because maybe it's taking longer to get something. Maybe the customer's requested a feature or something along those lines. And rather than telling the customer that there's no progress to report, they just don't communicate. It's much, much better to be able to say, hey, we don't have an update, but I promised you I would give you an update by 5 p.m. on a Wednesday. I'm reaching out to you to let you know we haven't taken our eye off the ball. We are still working on this. You're still our top priority. Here are some of the things that we've done, but we're going to need some more time. Something along those lines, just to make sure that they know that you've established a service level agreement, an SLA, and that you're hitting it. And if you can do that, I think it provides a tremendous amount of opportunity to be able to restore that trust. So customers want to know, like, the next time something happens, how is this going to work out for me? And so it's a great opportunity to showcase that. Internally, I find that there's a lot of folks that tend to be spectators when it comes to an escalation. What I mean by that is folks are interested in it, but don't really have skin in the game when it comes to actually resolve the issue. That can really muddy the waters internally because everybody has an opinion or everybody wants to, share their thoughts around how to do this. But ultimately, you want to clear out some of that noise. So one of the ways I like to do that is to create a centralized place for updates. That way, if folks, spectators in particular, want to follow along on what's happening with the escalation, they're always able to go to get that. So something like a Slack channel designated for this particular escalation works really well. You can put notes in Salesforce or your CRM, something along those lines. But I think there's an opportunity to allow people to come to a centralized place to get updates, as opposed to trying to anticipate everyone in the organization who wants to or is curious about what's going on. So I think that works pretty well.
Escalation are, what I feel are a tipping point, right? It's where if you don't handle it well, the customer is like halfway out the door in that situation. Of course, if
Okay.
you have identified the escalation correctly in the first place. But if that is the case, these are very difficult and important conversations. So when we are talking about communication, do you subscribe to the fact that should be different level of communication, as in, there's an executive level and then there's somebody who's doing operational? Because depending on, of course, the scenario, as long as it has, escalated, and let's say you've identified that if the issue comes from the senior level, from the customer end, that's definitely a very big escalation, as it's causing some problems at the
Yeah.
customer's end, right? So how do you identify that level of communication at multiple levels? Or
Yeah.
something has happened apparently which has caused big problems at the customer's end.
It's a very good point, and I think it goes back to that accountability owner in terms of what gets communicated to the customer, because there's oftentimes a lot of internal chatter about how to resolve the issue, and it may be experimental. It may not be that we have a clear, defined way of getting the
Correct.
issue resolved, and so there could be a lot of debate or internal discussion around, like, what if we try this idea? What if we try that idea? And what has to be really clear is what of that should be consumed by the customer or translated over to the customer. So to your point, there are I think just very candid conversations, like if and I'm thinking of a couple of examples, like uh if an engineer says, hey, I think we have a solution here, there may need to be some deliberate kind of poking of holes in that to say, like, how confident are you that we have a solution here? Should I be communicating that back to the customer? Should this be something that maybe we invite the customer into to participate in a possible solution and kind of work through it with them to make them part of the solution as well? There's a lot of, I guess, execution that happens, like, in terms of resolving the issue. And I think it's really incumbent to separate out what qualifies as an executive level update, to your point, versus what's a little bit more down in the trenches in terms of, hey, we're still working through
All
things.
right.
Let's try this, let's push this button. So it may require, and unfortunately for the person who is that accountability owner, it may require translating the updates to different stakeholders. I think it really is dependent upon the situation, but coming at it from a perspective that says, hey, I might need to put some extra effort here and, either call my senior level executive on the other side, or, send a group email to everyone on the other side. That's more of a judgment call, I think.
And what about a scenario where something has happened, which has caused a big problem already? Of course, you are trying to ensure it doesn't happen in the future, but it has already happened. And there's a lot of unhappiness. How do you handle this? Because I think this is something which is like you can't do anything now. It's in the past, but it already did happen. It caused, let's say by mistake, you deleted some very important information.
Yes.
Some bug, something happened and something got deleted and it caused a problem. You did rescue it after 3 days or 2 days or whatever within the time frame of SLA, but still that's something which is so big that it escalated all the way up. Now, how do
Yeah.
you handle the kind of communication here? What's the best strategy to make sure, do you own it, or how do you go about handling that?
Yeah. So again, at that moment, your goal is to restore trust. And so let's pretend a very serious issue happened. Data loss is among the most serious, of course. When
Yes.
something like that happens, a customer is going to really respond into one of two ways. Either we no longer trust you anymore and we're going to need to part ways, or We're unhappy that this happened, but we want to make sure it doesn't happen again, or at the very least that we have a real process on how to handle this should this happen
Absolutely.
again. So I think transparency is key here. If it does level up to, a very senior executive on the other side, I like to respond in kind. So if, the CEO is calling us, we should have our CEO on the line. I think it's having that match at that level is an important thing. And I do think that there is a tendency sometimes to overpromise in this situation. You just want to reassure the customer, this is never going to happen again, I promise. Like this is something that we've resolved 100%. I actually like to take an approach that's a little bit more muted than that. I think it's important to acknowledge we had a problem here. We believe that we have addressed the problem here, but here's what we will do in the unlikely event that this might happen again. Because what you don't want to do is, again, continue to erode that trust. In fact, I can specifically remember a scenario that we had where we had a major outage. What we chose to do was have a conference call with some of our largest customers and explain exactly what had happened. It was a hardware failure. Our failovers didn't work. Like, it was a very embarrassing situation. As we were on the phone with our customers, reassuring them that this was never going to happen again, it happened.
Oh
And
my
so
God.
literally, I know,
That's scary.
we had to interrupt the call. Our customers actually reported it to us as we were explaining. Our head of engineering was on the phone explaining to them what was happened, what preventative measures we've done. And they interrupted the call and they said, it's happening right now. So of course we had to interrupt the call and we had to do it all over again. But having that sense of transparency, I think is incredibly important. And does it take time? Yes. And does it always work? No. But you can help yourself by being as truthful and honest and really just making sure that they see you as a partner, even in the event that something bad
I
happens.
think the point that you made is to, that we have the tendency always to going and saying, this is never going to happen again.
Yeah.
And that's all of us have this tendency that, oh, don't worry, we have sorted it and this is never ever going to happen. But the way you explained it, I think it's very important to not just overpromise and say this is never going to happen, because you cannot control those things. But what needs to be done is that this happened and we have done A, B, C, D things,
Yeah.
which should ensure this should not happen, and there's a happening possibility is minimal. Let's say just changing it from a more transparent point of view.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's so dynamic. There are so many variables at play, whether it's integrated technology or changing of players or something like that. I think any commitments you make have to be sustainable, and they have to be sustainable for the long game. So if you're going to create for example, a specific process just for them, so that it's okay to do that, of course, but put some guardrails around it. Make sure that they understand this is temporary, or this is something that we're going to do for the next 60, 90 days. But if you commit to something long term, players change hands, expectations change, new technologies, new features emerge. It can be actually very, very difficult to continue to do that on a one-off basis. Not impossible. And if you choose that business is important enough to you, of course you could create that sideline process, but you don't want to do that again and again and again. It becomes unsustainable.
So, assuming you did everything right and had the right communication and solved the problem and talked to the right people, now the escalation has been managed, but the trust is ruined. Now, once that escalation, like at what time do you bring that customer back to the normal level of communication? Because post escalation also, I would think of it during onboarding process, you would say first 30 days and 60 days are very, very important, because the customer might leave and it's the right time to make sure you win that trust. And every escalation actually takes you back to that stage where you
Right.
have to win that trust again. You are still in that journey. So how do you handle the time after escalation? Because it's a delicate stage of the customer,
It
right?
is.
It's
Yeah,
like the
yeah.
fight, you had a big fight with your girlfriend and your girlfriend might, there's a chance of churn there.
No, it's a great analogy. It works. Yeah, a couple of things. So if we've reached that happy point where we feel that the escalation has been resolved, and sometimes that's very clear. There was a feature that was released or a defect that was fixed, and you have that real clear definition, like, okay, we resolved this issue. Sometimes it's a moving target, and a lot of it has to do with actually, and I love your analogy because a lot of it has to do with emotions. Sometimes people are not ready to really jump back in. They're going to be a little bit resistant to that. So I think there are a few ways that we can help ourselves here. So one is we need to continue with consistency around how we are managing them in the relationship. So when there is an exit from an escalated state, I think you need a real clear exit criteria. So we shouldn't be in sort of this limbo land, I guess, in terms of like, are they escalated? Are they not really escalated? That oftentimes there's sort of like a transition period that's required. So careful monitoring. Again, you still have somebody who is accountable to making sure that there isn't a relapse, and just making sure you maintain that proactive engagement. However, once you've kind of accomplished that, I think there also has to be a very transparent handoff process, kind of back to the normal management. Because often what happens, and we were saying this earlier, once customers get an executive's phone number or something like that, they're apt to kind of bypass the processes that you've created, which are really designed to help them in the most efficient way possible, and kind of reach out to whoever they have at their beck and call. So we do want to almost retrain them to say, like, okay, we've now wrapped this up. Here's what the next 30, 60, 90 days are going to look like. Here's how we're going to continue to make sure that we're monitoring the situation, and that you're not back stepping. But ideally, that requires some proactive outreach. So you've got, let's say an executive was involved in the escalation. Maybe that executive checks in 2 weeks later to just say, how are things now that the dust has settled? Are we still, have we restored your trust? Are there more things that we need to do? And there may be, like, trust is a very elusive state. So if we fractured that, it may be that there is extra effort that we need to make to rebuild that relationship. But it doesn't necessarily mean they need to stay in that escalated state. They just may be unhealthy. And so it takes time sometimes to get them back to the healthy track.
Adding on to a slightly different angle to the question, uh, there are sometimes customers who would always love to escalate.
Oh,
At the
yes.
moment it has happened once, it becomes very hard for the person who is managing the customer on a day-to-day basis, as customer success executive and account manager, because every time something is a little up and down, they would immediately go all the way up to the executive. Now this happens in all our lives. This has happened. I want to know, how do you handle this? Because this is not in the best interest of the customer or the company. And typically, whatever the problem is, the company is the same people are going to handle it.
Yes.
Obviously, the CEO, the executive is not going to do it. He will, of course, make sure it gets done. But somehow there's a feel that, if I escalate to the executive, it'll get done faster. So how do you handle to make sure this does not continue to happen? Like, how do you, as an account manager, how do you win that trust that you don't
Yeah.
need to go to my executive actually?
It's such a good. I'm smiling because I'm reminded of a particular situation. But I think as the relationship manager, you have to have the confidence to be able to go to your own executive team to be able to say, I need your help. So if this person is reaching out to my CEO, for example, I need to have a conversation with my CEO to say, I'm so grateful that you'll take the call. However, the next time they reach out to you, I really do want you to encourage them to use the processes that are in place. Have them come
Absolutely.
to me. I can quarterback this. I can make sure we bring it to your attention. I'll keep you updated. But ultimately, we need to retrain the customer. You hope that they're open to that, and it may take some time. Again, you can't really. You have to allow them to go through their emotional journey. If they're just picking up the phone and calling your CEO because it's easier for them, you want to correct that behavior. If they're picking up the CEO, picking up the phone and calling your CEO because they don't trust you, work to do. But I think in that situation, sometimes you just have to have a very candid conversation with the customer to simply explain, hey, anytime you escalate this, like you have my attention. Like I am going to make sure that we are successful together. Let's examine how we can do that differently. Because when you bring my CEO in, I actually get pulled into explaining it to them, and I can't actually work on your issue. So explaining sort of the consequences that they may not really consider of bringing in other parties and the management that requires with so many different people working on things. Um, using language like, I can't support you the best that I can if I'm learning about these things secondhand from other people in the organization, or something along those lines. So I do think you need to have a candid conversation. I'm reminded of a particular scenario that I had with a CEO on the other side who was doing exactly what you described and just escalating. Everything was urgent. Everything was urgent. And I had to have a conversation, a very candid conversation with them to say, listen, when everything is urgent, nothing is urgent because we don't know how
Exactly.
to distinguish your priorities. And so what I really want to do is agree with you right now. What are the top three things that we want to accomplish over the next 30 days? And let's put all of our effort into those three things. And let's agree mutually that if if something comes up that is not one of those top three things, that we're going to either put that off to the side or we're going to replace one of those things. But I need to keep my team focused on supporting you the best way that we can. And when we're going on all these different directions and everything's a new issue every day, we're actually having a very hard time supporting you with that. And I don't
Absolutely.
think we're making the progress that you want us to see. So if you have a conversation like that with the customer, I found more often than not, they tend to be open to it.
Great. This happens a lot in early stage companies because initially the founder is the one who's talking, right?
Yeah.
And then as the business grows, there are team members brought in who are senior enough. And of course, they are able to handle new customers. But
Mhm.
the early few customers, they are used to, picking up the phone and calling the founder. And that becomes very hard to handle the communication and to hand them over that, listen, you're in good hands and these guys will handle. But I think the way you explained it, it's the same structure, right? It's the same process, the same things that needs to be managed in that scenario as well.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the customer is going to tell you whether or not you're delivering. And it
Yes.
may be that they don't agree that you're giving them the level of service that they expect. So it's a great scenario where you described the founder-led support, right? So early stage companies, founders solving all the problems and goes and codes on the weekend and comes back. It's like, hey, I solved your problem. Like that's a very white glove level of service, which is wonderful for those companies that receive that. Over time, as the company scales, they may not receive that level of service. And so I think there is an adjustment, a conscious adjustment of expectations that's required there. Now, again, some customers may be more resistant to that. Some may be okay with that. At the end of the day, it's all about driving back to the business outcomes. What is the
Right.
customer getting from your solution? How do you make sure that they understand that, yes, maybe the service has changed a little bit or the way that you get support has changed a little bit, but at the end of the day, we're still performing for you. We're still driving the outcomes that you're looking for. And again, with that accountability, you put somebody else in the place where they can start to build that trust and build that confidence in the expanded team.
Now I want to talk about the last part that I find most
Okay.
fascinating.
Yes.
The storm has gone. We have handled it. Now we need to find out what the hell happened, right? And
Yes.
second, whatever happened, how to make sure it doesn't happen again with
Yeah.
someone else. What can we do better?
I love that you brought this up. I'm so passionate about this one. So, and I really think this is an often overlooked step. And I don't think it's necessarily intentional, but everyone's busy. And there's sort of that emotional relief that you, as the recipient, feel when the escalation is finally over,
Yes.
and you're like, oh, thank goodness. All right, I can breathe again. I can go focus on these other 12 things that I wasn't able to get to. Um, I really want to caution and guard against that impulse because you've had you don't want to lose the lesson. You've had a very bad situation which has occurred. And if you lose the lesson, you lose the opportunity to be able to prevent that again from happening
Absolutely.
in the future. So I'm a huge fan of this. I actually think that this is one of the steps that requires maybe not quite as much effort as the escalation itself, but it could. Because essentially what you want to do is you want to reverse engineer, how did this customer get into this escalated state to begin with? In some cases, it may be completely obvious. Maybe the service went down, we had a defect features, whatever it could be. But and oftentimes it's sort of a collection of things that has occurred and has eroded some of that trust, some of that confidence. And reverse engineering that may not be a very clear picture, but spending time on a postmortem, be able to understand a little bit more about why did this happen to begin with, allows you as a company to not just focus on, putting out the fire, but fire prevention. And that is where you really start to see, I think, your service levels improve over time.
True.
Because if you can go back, and I like to call it, you look upstream to figure out where the problem happened. When you do that, you're able to stop future problems from occurring. And that's how you start to get out of this escalated state where everything is a fire drill. Everyone is just, responding. But unless you actually take some of those preventative measures, you're always going to be in that escalated state. So does it require additional work? Yes. Is it incredibly important? 100%.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And at times, when the escalation has happened, you try to find out the reason, but the
Yes.
root cause would have been a little behind that, a little
Yes.
more upstream in the process. So that's the immediate problem which you are trying to solve at the point, and you would have, obviously, but the genesis of that problem would have been maybe a few steps behind into the journey of the customer in the organization.
Exactly right. Yeah, and it could be anywhere throughout the life cycle. So it could be, classic example is sales has oversold the account. Well, okay, so if they oversold the account, was that a specific rep who needs some additional training? Was that a piece of marketing collateral that the reps were working off of? Was that a selling tool that they have? What is the situation? Or maybe they got a bad group of leads that just don't, match our ICP or
Yes.
something along those lines. Like, could be a lot of different things, but if you start to analyze that, you can start to detect some patterns, and then maybe there are, some small changes that you can make to the organizational process, which could have massive impact in a positive way down the road.
Create catchments in the process that it doesn't move forward.
Yes.
From wherever it's coming. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Amazing, Parker. Thank you. Thank you very much.
This was
awesome discussion.
Yeah, it's a topic that I'm passionate about.
Yeah, I didn't realize how long it's been. I just checked my watch. I said, okay, we need to stop. Otherwise, me and you, we can continue to talk about escalations, which is something I think you may have handled it like thousands and thousands of times in your journey. Anything very specific that pops in your head? Anything in terms of escalation that you handle that you remember?
Sort of a key takeaway. I mean, I think I really do like sort of the beginning and the end. So the beginning is really making sure that you're focusing on what is a definition of an escalation, because I think agreeing on that and then reinforcing that too. I think that's a very common misconception is once you train on what an escalation is, you have to actually retrain because your team is changing. So new sales reps are coming on board, new implementation specialists, whatever it is, you need to continually make sure that training is reinforced. So make sure that you're investing in your team. They understand the processes. They understand when there is the need to really get something bubbled up, that they're able to do that efficiently. And then, as we said at the end, really make sure that you're always investing in finding out what happened. So don't just be satisfied with the escalation being resolved, but spend time on identifying the root cause of that and then addressing that, because that will allow you to really elevate your game. Going back to what we said earlier, if escalations are growth inhibitors, that is a major lever that you can pull to improve your growth and your profitability is by reducing your escalations. I mean, they're so costly in terms of time, resources, morale. I mean, it's just they're very destructive, and so it's trying to find a way to prevent them from happening has a massive benefit.
So don't miss the resolution steps. Yeah. Don't miss the last step for sure. Otherwise, you'll be firefighting for forever.
That's true. Yeah, you got to stop the cycle.
Yes, stop the cycle. Awesome, Parker. Thank you very much. We had an amazing time having this discussion with Parker. Thanks a ton for joining our podcast. Time flies when you're having a great discussion, and it definitely was. Thank you very much. Parker, thanks a lot for being here, and I hope the listeners enjoyed this as much as we did. Big thanks to everyone who tuned in, and you can contact Parker on LinkedIn. He is a consultant, so if you are facing these problems, he can take you from frustrations to resolutions, and he can take you in that journey with a lot of experience that comes with the work that he has done over the years. Thanks, Parker. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Appreciate it, Mausmi. Thank you.